Entrepreneurial ecosystems were built on giving back. Are we still doing that? How did it change in the pandemic and since? We'll talk about that today on Builders Live. Hey, I'm Chris Wink. I am the co-founder and CEO of Technology, the news organization with a community of technologists and entrepreneurs. Over my career of reporting on entrepreneurial ecosystems, I so remember this give back promise, that this idea was, well, in maturing ecosystems, what we need is a first or a second generation of modern entrepreneurs who might build on the web or with tech tools or otherwise modern disciplines. And once they have great financial success, they'll then give back. Sometimes that might be angel investing, it might be speaking at events, networking, mentoring, connections. This was the idea: build, stack, build. And I watched that happen in at least a half dozen ecosystems leading into the pandemic. I have a theory, though, that some of that broke down and it looks different now. I'm writing on that and I need help to figure it out. So to get that help, I've enlisted my friend Chris Heivly, entrepreneur, writer. He's a book series called Build the Fort, both for entrepreneurs and a newer edition focused on a building of sorts. Chris, national leader, you talk so often about giving back. Thank you for being here to help me figure out this topic.
Thanks for asking me, fellow Chris.
Yeah, this is the Chris episode. All right. Start me off with some foundation laying. I think of you as one of these guys who I remember as long as I've known you as talking about the give back loop, as it were. Talk to me a bit about what that means for those who maybe don't see it as a unique qualifier of entrepreneurial ecosystems. Maybe start with what was it like when we talked about it in the 2010s, and we'll get to the more modern sense.
Yeah, Chris. Well, I feel really lucky in that I think the DNA of me was already kind of a give back person in a way. I just probably didn't manifest it to the level that I do today, or I have over the last 15 years. But I'll tell you, 2009, I got reconnected to Brad Feld. Hopefully most of the people in the audience know who he is and what he's done. And though we didn't have the phrase at the time, he's later now called that give first, which is different than pay it forward. Maybe, and I don't think we need to kind of slice this up into pieces, but he kind of injected in me an idea as I started kind of doing quote unquote community building in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, this idea of just helping, just serving founders at its kind of most basic piece. And, as I've come to know that, and I've taught mentorship, workshops, I've helped him a little bit on his latest book called Give First. The notion is pretty simple. And that is that you lean in and you're the first one to say, let me help. What can I do to help? Really the simplest question you could do in the world, with no expectation that you're going to get anything in return. Now, I can tell you, kind of, teasing the end already, you get so much back. It's unbelievable. And it comes in ways that you can't even imagine, right? So I was lucky enough to kind of get that seed planted. And just to illustrate what this meant for me, in 2009, I was new to the Raleigh-Durham area, having moved from Chicago a couple of years previously. I did 275 one-on-ones in about 5 months. And that really kind of and I just went in, and at the end of every one of those, I said, how can I help? Now, most of the time, Chris, it's an introduction. Sometimes it's a little mentoring session. Sometimes it could have been an investment on my end. But most of the time, it was just building a connection that ends up being so rich that it brings a little joy to me. So I lay that out. I lay that as a foundation to say, when you're really this give back loop, regardless of where you are, by the way, in your journey, the ability to give back to someone without this kind of transactional mindset, the problem with classic networking, it feels transactional. When you do that with a give first, give back, pay it forward, whatever phrase you want to use, the person that you're working with gets a lot more out of it than maybe they would have before. And then here's the hidden secret. You get punch out of it as well.
So let me call it a few things there to set up our conversation. As you said, Brad Feld, Techstars investor, kind of, longtime champion of Boulder, Colorado's ecosystem, author himself. that and you and others embodied something that I then experienced over 20 years, sometimes done superficially, I will add. Like sometimes that hustler founder I sometimes found, like, heard the concept and said that a lot to me through the years, and I didn't always either like believe them or also actually secretly felt very transactional. I'm only here to so I can help. But in a broader sense, I then found those people who were very serious about it, who like it really was informed why we use the ecosystem metaphor so much in this space, that many different overlapping systems and people and species who don't always really know how literally they react or interact, because it's just complicated. I think also about that like kind of signal and noise concept. I love the founding myth of Genentech, who kind of creates the foundational idea of life sciences as an industry. Famously, it's a 28-year-old out of work, unemployed, ambitious guy calling an advanced researcher at San Francisco State saying, "Hey, I have an idea for your research." And her boy or the researcher's like, "All right, sure, you have insight on my research, but I let a little signal in, I'm going to give back." They do a quick beer, and actually it sparks, ends up being transformational. That's like a canonical example of sometimes you're not sure who actually has a little piece of the puzzle for you. And that was what I've always perceived as what startup ecosystems or entrepreneurial ecosystem building was meant to be about. We don't really know how these systems work. And so you just have to be somewhat generous about it, and you'll build forward. So that's one leg that I then saw ecosystems around the country talking about. Hey, we need to embody this spirit of, we have some established institutions, we have some established business leaders, we have a fledgling entrepreneurial ecosystem that is building on the web. We need these worlds to interact a bunch because we don't know how the systems will interact. And so a give back loop is one of the foundations of how regions are going to start an entrepreneurial ecosystem. There also was a money component too that I remember so often us talking about, that, hey, your first generation of entrepreneurial success will mint some dollars, and then those might write those entrepreneurial minded angel investment checks for the next generation, and away we'll go. And I've been pulling some data that somewhat did happen. But maybe like speed me up, Chris, of, it's 2009 to 2010, 2011, 2012. You're getting this language down. You're building this preach where we're all saying it. Now it's been, 10 plus years, and maybe talk to me a bit about what proved true about the power of the give back loop, and talk to me a little bit about where we are now or closer to that.
Sure. Stop me if I go too deep, right? I only think about this thing every day for
the good news on Builders Live, Chris, we're talking to these are you're inside the machine talking to other machinists.
So, my research and my understanding and my observations, and everyone wants to kind of emulate the Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And the way they do that is by putting up buildings or putting up venture funds. And it turns out, and it goes as far back as Andy Grove at Intel and Steve Jobs at a brand new Apple, meeting every week for business advice.
Yeah.
So So you want to start emulating the Valley, like start there. Don't start with fancy buildings or venture funds or things like that, right? That comes later. What that does, this give back loop, regardless of where you are in your journey. So let me put a pin in this for a second. You've been 2 years into your startup journey. The question most of you ask is, what can I do to help my ecosystem? I'm like, to someone who's on day one, a ton. In fact, you are more valuable than an old grizzled vet like me or you, who, our days kind of passed. Well, at least mine is, not yours. You're still building. But, so that is a cultural foundation of a great ecosystem. It usually manifests itself easily in mentorship, and later, hopefully, in capital. Okay.
I wanted you to keep going, but I just want to underline, because I love that point that, like, it is that often the person a couple piano lessons ahead of you has so much more than the 1,000. Because the answer is, in my experience, often you either don't remember why you were successful, or as you said, situations have changed so much that actually, truly, my advice is almost meaningless because it's just a different landscape now.
Well, my success as one of the co-founders of MapQuest, 40 miles west of you in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Okay. Right. And people all the time, once a week, says, so tell me how you did this at MapQuest. I'm like, not relevant.
Yeah.
First of all, 30 years ago,
Yeah.
None of these tools existed. The idea of customer discovery wasn't even something, none of my experiences, like you just said, are relevant. So let's go back to what I've learned in the last 2 years, right? Talking to 100 of you all, right? And being in, probably 8 to 12 ecosystems a year at this point. So great point, right? And I learned that, by the way, building my first accelerator when I brought in the CEO of a $600 million public tech company. And I'm thinking, like, I nailed him. And he comes in and he's 5 minutes into his chat in front of these 12 founders. And I'm like, oh, shit, this is just wrong.
Right.
He, love him, but like not relevant. And he didn't even found the company. He was brought in as CEO, right? So
right. But probably had great advice for running a $600 million company, like
or even $100 million company, right?
Right.
So we talked about kind of mentorship, which is to me like a foundational element. Now, by the way, I think the best mentorship is one-on-one. There's an opportunity to kind of start creating the give back loop earlier in your journey and earlier in career, even pre-success, if you're talking about success as an exit, right? And so I learned that really heavily doing it myself. Then I set up my own accelerator for 5 years. And I don't want to say taught, that sounds very kind of like directional, but created an environment where people came in to talk to the founders in my accelerator, and we were reinforcing this give back thing. And so they came in as mentors. They'd spend an hour, they'd spend a day, they'd come in a couple times, they do lunches, they show up at, demo day and all that kind of stuff. So that mentorship, I think, is the easy and actually very important part, especially in smaller, less mature communities. We tend to want to skip by that or do mentorship programmatically, which to me doesn't work as much as just you and I sitting down and talking about whatever it is that's on our minds or that we're struggling with.
Yeah, well, keep going. There's so much you're saying, but yeah, keep going.
If you want to go deeper on mentorship, we can hold, and then capital's the next piece I was going to talk about.
Touch on capital. I'm writing notes.
So the next thing is, if you are, good and lucky enough, both, to get to a point where you have some kind of exit, is can you recycle your capital? Can you, is capital recycled? That's a loop, right? That's a give back thing. And, and it was part of what happens in a lot of communities. I think the hard thing is it's very hard to engineer or accelerate that, right? Like we both know, and hopefully all our listeners know that, it's 8 to 12 years for a typical exit these days. And there's like I like to say, there's no express train to the top of Everest, right? You got to go through each one of those 4 base camps, and each one gives you the permission to get the next one. So there's some, maybe you can tweak it, but, we're talking about almost generational in a way, right? So you have to have both the urgency of helping today and the patience to wait for those things to evolve, which is really difficult.
I'm writing this last point as I love that the urgency of helping today and the patience for that we'll come back to that. See it evolve. So let's look back to a couple points there. Well, let me, because you and I talked a little bit about this, maybe push my theory on thinking something changed or broke in pandemic. I've been pushed that I sometimes over rely on that, but I just think there's like such a seismic cultural event happens that I kind of feel like everything in every industry. So you can plausibly say it changed. And I actually think on the whole, you're right in some form. And I felt like I viewed something happening where, and again, I think I'm pulling from like a good number of ecosystems here. I don't think this is 2 or 3. I think I'm got 6, 7, 8 in mind here, where, one, there was an event culture, and a lot of those events there was a place to go where there were only 20, 30, 40 people, very familiar in homebrew computer club, like early days. And there were like a couple founders who had really done it. And there were some that were in it right then and some who were hoping to do it. And I remember in 2018 or 2019, a lot of places that felt very healthy. And I think better than most, a lot of regional leaders mistook that for underwhelming when we were like, no, that is like, it is happening right now in front of your eyes is what you want to see. And partly those more experienced founders had to be there because there wasn't quite the same kind of virtual connectivity, I think. And so we were having this forced kind of lab space in a lot of places around the country, and those connections were happening. It felt very natural. And then I felt like I watched in the cheap money era surge of the pandemic era, a lot of those companies really popped, and we technically covered a bunch of unicorns who we could trace it back directly to some connections in an ecosystem. It felt like it was working.
Right.
And I feel like I am watching a total reset, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but something broke, I think, in the handoff of the give back mentality for some founders in some places. I have a theory. What do you think about said theory?
Well, you're totally right and totally wrong all at the same time. Of course, Chris.
Get that a lot. Yeah.
Not the first time you've heard that.
Yeah.
You're right. Things drastically changed, and for some places, and for some founders, I think it's very complex, right? And so I think it depends on the maturity of the ecosystem. I think it depends on where you were in your founder journey.
Yeah.
And then I think it depends on the maturity. Like we just talked about, great ecosystems have a natural one-on-one mentorship thing that evolves. If that wasn't there, and then that became problematic. If culturally most of that mentorship and connection came through public events, obviously, right? We just shut that off I said like this, but it's like a light switch, right?
Right.
So then I think of the founder, if you understood that building a network and activating that on a daily, weekly basis was part of your jam, then I don't think you lost a step. And in fact, I might even argue that the sense of geography of having to be at an activity in your city or region as a way to meet more people, all of a sudden that geography went away, and I think your network could expand to people.
Yes.
And now, you and I were happy to spend, maybe happy is the wrong word, but we now became part of our thing that we would spend all day on Zoom calls or Teams calls or Google Meet. So, I can now do 6 or 8 of those a day if I needed to, and meet more people, and founder could find me. If you're a first-time founder thinking you're going to start something in pandemic, not in an ecosystem that doesn't have this, I will connect you seamlessly and frictionlessly, then I think it was probably broke for you. And, it reinforced the bad parts of what immature communities do and says, well, just stay in your back office, your garage, your basement, and toil away individually, and don't worry, that would be broken, and that would be bad, right?
Like you're making me think about kind of like a K-shaped economy comparison to like K-shaped entrepreneurial experiences, where Chris, what you said resonates a bunch with me. I felt in a lot of ways for my entrepreneurial journey, at least being very narrowly about my entrepreneurial journey, the pandemic, incredibly stressful, but so helpful. I did find myself reaching out to kind of friends who I vaguely knew, but would only bump into once in a while at a conference or whatever. And I felt like I strengthened and elevated my network. And I think technically as a company advanced so much in such a rapid period of time. 1, stress, yes. But 2, I do think with an already existing network, it was great for me.
Agreed.
So efficient for me. And I think a lot of founders, in my experience, when I've been prodding a little bit, they sometimes forget that like their experience was not the first time founders are most experienced. They already had kind of a network. And so for them, it was great. And that's the give back loop that I'm worried some are missing, that, hey, remember all the value you got out of bumping into the person who was a few piano lessons ahead of you? If you're not there at the physical event, or, intentionally doing the office hours, or like, yes, I'll happily do the 20-minute call with that founder who might feel a little lost and I might not think they're as serious yet because they're figuring it out. That signal and the noise, I worry we're lost. And I want to find a way to push entrepreneurs to be like, if you've had some success, remember to give back a little bit. Are you seeing that at all? Am I being too critical? Sometimes I'm too critical of founders.
No. And by the way, it's not just founders, right?
Mm.
And I also think potentially generational, and not to overgeneralize about age, but
Mm-hmm.
I have 42, 37, and 32-year-old children. I've had to push them, like, you got to connect with people, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think the tendency has been, through all the technology applied over the last 10 years, is to become more insular and more private and more singular. And again, they're probably saying, yeah, great, boomer. But, I'm saying, I think live connections are still extremely valuable. So, I have this little theory, right? So, or not a theory, concept.
Mm.
We just talked about building connections, right? And I think the activities that we do, the public, that I'm talking about, events, are a way to create connection. Great. You and I meet, we shake hands. 20 years ago, we'd exchange business cards. Now we either, do a LinkedIn QR code, or we, give each other our phones and say, let's connect. Okay. So that's the connection. However, that's just the start. That's not the end.
Mm-hmm.
The value comes when those connections become meaningful. And I think it's a lot hard. First of all, if you're not doing it, if you're not connecting, you can't get to meaningful. Meaningful is when you get a new employee, an investment, a customer, a partner, a co-founder, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everything we need in a startup comes back to people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're not connecting and building meaningful connections, I believe you're overstressing your startup journey.
Mm.
So whether that's age or maturity or whatever, meaningfulness comes when you give back. It becomes not transactional when I say, how can I help? And then I do it for you. That means our relationship deepens and it becomes more meaningful. So going back to your theory, COVID stressed that, but it made us have to find ways to building meaningful connections.
Mm.
I will tell you that, I'm in Raleigh, Durham. I just spent 5 years flying over the world doing this for ecosystems, not my own.
Mm-hmm.
And towards the end of that run, right leading into pre-COVID, and then especially in COVID, I got a couple, I put my band back together and started Raleigh Durham Startup Week.
Mm-hmm.
And my theory was, and I asked everyone that, that I had worked with, that I had become friends with, a subset that said, hey, would you want to help build this with me? Was, I still believe meaningful connections have to be done live when you shake someone's hand and look them in the eye. So maybe I'm a boomer, I don't know, but I still think people need and want that, even if they don't know it.
I think more boomer than believers. I think I count myself as that, and I've had my own experiences in a couple of market technical reports on, like, going back to basics for the meetup. I hadn't restarted a meetup in 12 years probably, and man, it looked so familiar to me. The first one was a dozen people kind of chit chatting, then it was 30, and then it was 40, and like the quality was good, and people said it was just a connection. And I was like, this is exactly what we were talking about in 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because I think we learned the lesson in the 70s, and I think we learned the lesson in generations past, that especially around emerging technologies, but whenever a thing is changing quickly, it is helpful to just have a space to kind of share best practices. It's very kind of give back of, like, we all know, don't come and sell your thing, just come and be a person. And we all are learning and exchanging, which is what the spirit of those computer clubs were at that point too. Hey, we're trying to figure this stuff out. How are you playing with it? That strikes me as what, in my entire career around this, is so consistent anywhere I've ever gone around the world, that it was doing. It started with that. A bunch of people kind of sharing ideas and practices, and then magic happens. And one of the things I most often yell at policymakers or economic development leaders is, I think to them it always looks so modest that they always think something is wrong in XYZ place. Because why are there only a dozen people there? And I'm like, you're staring at the seed before the tree, and you don't understand why the tree isn't bigger.
Yeah.
So I'm going to lose you in a sec, but yeah, react to that. I want to ask you 2 questions before I lose you.
Yeah. Well, what I will tell you, back to the COVID driver, when we've launched the first year, we've now done 4 years of this Startup Week. we had 200 to 300 people show up, but I expected a lot more. I expected people really wanted to do that. I think COVID taught us that we can kind of hang at home and didn't need to connect.
Yes.
And so two things. One, I think we had to be a lot smarter about those things and really giving them an excuse to get out of their homes, right? Or their offices. And so we had, which is good, which means we needed to be relevant again, and we needed to kind of meet them where they were. Now, to your point about the 12 or the 18 people showing up or whatever it was, that's the other thing is you got to start slow and let the ecosystem kind of, lean in. Here we are 4 years later, we had 1,500 people show up. We have 6,000 people on our mailing list. We're now doing monthly events, because people now trust that when they came, they got a great experience.
Yes.
And I think COVID made us have to work harder to create that experience and make sure they knew that it was obviously relevant to them.
Yes. Total reset. I think that for me is what I'm saying to people around the country is you just had a reset. And so you can't use your 2019 or whatever benchmark. You started over. And I felt that time and time again it is a start over.
By the way, as a startup guy, I love that.
Yes. Well, and I think similarly, I did a couple coffee chats in Tech Newsroom, and I was like, this actually is very endearing. It reminds me, it feels exactly like what I remember we were doing in 2008. It felt so familiar. All right, I'm going to lose you in a sec. Maybe touch on the capital thing, because that was the last one I didn't hit, and then I can round us up. Because that is obviously the visceral one. I so remember this is what I was told in my early reporting on this stuff was, hey, this startup's going to mint some millionaires, or the founders are going to do great. And then that might have only been a modest success by whatever benchmark, but then they're going to reinvest. And a few generations later, you get that. I'm going to, for the story that I'm putting together, I'm going to try to find some kind of data sources to learn more about whether that has happened and where is it and in what forms. But I guess talk to me a little bit about, you've been at this now a while. Make me a believer again. Have you really seen that happen, of that generation of, startup success funded the next one? Where is it not happening? How do we do that better? Just talk to me a little bit about the capital leg of your framework.
Yeah. So the starting point for this is your ecosystem. You have to have been at it probably in the 15 to 20, 25 year mark, because I just told you that it's going to take probably 10 years for some of them just to get to that point. And yes, you might have had one, but it's when you get 3 or 4 when that capital flywheel starts to turn. So there's a little bit about the patience, right? Now, in just about every community, there's some high net worth people, but in many of the communities that we work with, what I would consider to be tier 2 and tier 3, those high net worth people are usually inheriting their money, or, they're one of the old families, and they don't usually get tech, right? Because they were in manufacturing or something. So it makes it a little harder for that capital to kind of start cycling, but there's a way to do that. And so that's a little bit back to the patience. What my best experience I can talk about in Raleigh-Durham, and I'll give you two great examples. Joe Colopy built a email marketing platform that was acquired by Oracle, which then got by NetSuite, and then got acquired by when NetSuite got acquired by Oracle. 200 plus employees, raised very little venture capital, did very, very well himself, and probably took him a year or so, but he now runs 2 different funds of his own money. He sets up, you and I've talked about him. He set up his own kind of little publishing platform called Grepbeat, that talks about the which a small little publishing platform is the best not break even business you can be in. If you don't do it right, it's very difficult. But that's one way that he is given back, and he's decided to do that inside of his own little venture fund. 2 different kind of venture funds that he has going. Scott Wingo, 3-time exited entrepreneur, very savvy. One of his startups, has been a public company for probably close to 10 years now. He went a slightly different route. He built a index fund through AngelList that you and I, as accredited investors, can put, I think originally 20 grand a year, then 30 grand, very kind of, each cohort is a year. Fast forward, I think 5 years later now, and his concept was, I would invest a little bit in everything and not have to kind of choose winners at the early stage. I got a little bit ahead of myself. He first started something called the tweener list. Those were companies that were kind of like in between, right? They hadn't broken out yet, but they had probably 15 to 20 companies, about maybe $1 million ARR. And there was 50 companies in his list, and he would publish it once a year. And the number of times that all of us would just point new employees, new founders, to that list for mentorship, for jobs, for whatever. And so fast forward, he then built the tweener fund on top of that. Took, small little LP checks. To date, 300 people in the tweener list in Raleigh, Durham. 165 investments, and he's put about 11 million into play. Over 165 investments, but 220 investment. So some of them got, they doubled down on. And I want to tell you that story to say, like, there's different ways that you could kind of recycle your capital or your time or your efforts. Here's two completely different players in the Raleigh Durham ecosystem. That's not Sequoia or, Benchmark or, these are small little activities that are really appropriate for where the majority of our community, which is pretty high, but not quite, obviously, Valley or New York or even Boston, right? So we have to continue to invest at that kind of level. But those are two ways, and why do they invest? You'd have to ask them personally, but I think they just felt this give back. They felt this thing. They've had success. They didn't go run and hide and bought a Ferrari and a beach house and said, sayonara.
Man, I could go longer on that too, Chris, but I can't. I've already taken you long. This idea of give back is something that I've always found very inspiring. I think folks routinely overlook it or discount it. So thank you for being such a long champion of it, Chris. I'm going to drop a link below the video in our story to the Build the Fort series. A two-book series is available at buildthefort.com. Chris, thank you as always for your expertise, your insight. You're writing great newsletter, by the way. If you're not already, we'll drop a link to Chris's newsletter. Subscribe there. Chris, thanks for your perspective.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, well, fellow Chris, we'll see you next time. See you, friends.